If you're watching this video, you're probably going to sleep right now, just before you do. I want to know where you're watching from in the world and what the time is right now for you. Make sure to subscribe and like. I had been working 12-hour days for 3 straight weeks. Deadlines, corporate meetings, the usual grind. I wasn't doing it for anyone else either. No family, no girlfriend, no friends who'd care enough to ask me to slow down. Just me and the endless climb up the corporate ladder. By Friday night, I couldn't take it anymore. I booked a secluded cabin in the woods of Virginia, rustic but modern enough for heating and hot water. Just a place to unplug for the weekend. The drive there was exhausting, but the kind of exhaustion that made me feel accomplished. I left the city lights behind for winding roads framed by skeletal trees. Snow flurries danced in the beams of my headlights, and the forest swallowed everything else. When I finally pulled into the gravel driveway, I could feel my body relax for the first time in weeks. The cabin stood there, quiet and inviting, framed by the silhouettes of trees and a dark open sky. Inside, I dropped my bag on the couch and exhaled, letting the silence wash over me. It felt good. The kind of good that only comes when you've left the chaos behind. I lit a fire, opened a bottle of cheap whiskey, and sat on the couch with a book I had been meaning to start. For hours, the world outside was a distant memory, and I felt like I could finally breathe again. At some point, I fell asleep. When I woke up, the fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the cabin was cold. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made every creak of the wood sound sharper. I glanced at my phone. 1 a.m. I groaned and got up to throw another log on the fire. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, just barely audible over the wind outside. It wasn't the howl of the wind or the snap of a branch. It was something else. A low guttural sound. Almost like an animal, but not quite. I froze, my hand hovering over the firewood. The sound came again, this time louder, closer. My first thought was a coyote, or maybe a stray dog. The woods were full of wildlife, and I had no reason to be alarmed. Still, there was something about the sound that put me on edge. I shook it off, grabbed a log, and tossed it into the fireplace. The crackling flames filled the room with warmth, and I convinced myself I was overreacting. I sat back down, but the uneasy feeling didn't leave. I told myself it was the isolation, the unfamiliar quiet of the woods playing tricks on my mind. I poured another glass of whiskey and tried to focus on my book, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That's when I heard footsteps on the porch. I froze. The heavy thud of boots or paws on wood echoed through the silence. My heart pounded as I stared at the door. Maybe it was a deer, I thought, or a bear. Bears don't knock, though. And then it came again. This time, the sound was deliberate. Slow, deliberate steps circling the cabin. I grabbed the poker from the fireplace and stood up. The air in the cabin felt suffocating. My phone was on the couch, useless. No signal, no help. Just me and whatever was outside. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear. Then came the sound of scratching. Long, drawn-out scratches on the door, like something testing it, feeling it out. I moved toward the door, my hand gripping the poker tightly. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice steadier than I expected. No response, just the scratching, slow and deliberate. Then it stopped. Silence again, so heavy it pressed down on me. I stayed there for what felt like hours, listening, waiting. Finally, I built up the courage to look outside. I opened the door a crack, just enough to peek. The cold hit me like a slap, and the forest stared back, empty and still. Snow was falling heavier now, and the porch was covered in a thin layer of white. But there in the snow were tracks, not boot prints, not paw prints, something else. Long, uneven impressions, like a combination of both. They led off the porch and into the woods. I shut the door and locked it, my breath coming fast. Whatever it was gone. I told myself it was just an animal, something I couldn't explain but harmless all the same. I sat back down by the fire, forcing myself to calm down. But deep down, I knew the night wasn't over. Hours passed, but I didn't sleep. The fire burned low again, and the whiskey didn't help. Every sound outside made me jump. The wind, the creak of the cabin, the distant crack of a branch. Then, just before dawn, I heard it again. The footsteps. This time, they didn't stop at the porch. They circled the cabin, slow and deliberate. I stayed frozen in my chair, gripping the poker, listening as the footsteps came closer and closer to the windows. I didn't look. I couldn't. I just waited, every muscle in my body tense, until the first light of dawn crept through the windows. When the sun rose, the footsteps stopped. The forest was quiet again, as if nothing had happened. But when I finally stepped outside, I saw the tracks. They circled the cabin, over and over, weaving in and out of the trees. And then they disappeared into the woods. I didn't stay to find out what it was. I packed my things and left, the weight of the silence pressing down on me as I drove back to the city. I never went back to that cabin, and I don't think I ever will. Whatever it was out there, it wasn't just an animal. It was something else. Something that watched, waited, and knew exactly how to make you feel like you were never truly alone. It was one of those long, quiet nights where the ticking of the clock seemed louder than usual. The November air had a sharp edge to it, and the cold seeped into the house despite the heater humming softly in the background. I had just finished cleaning up after dinner, the faint scent of soap lingering on my hands as I settled into the couch with a book. The house felt still, the kind of stillness that would normally comfort me. But tonight, there was something off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the silence felt heavier, like it was holding its breath. The first sound was barely noticeable, just a faint shuffle. I told myself it was the wind, brushing leaves against the side of the house. Still, I found myself pausing, holding the book mid-page and straining to listen. Nothing. I shook my head and laughed softly. "You're being ridiculous." But even as I went back to reading, a knot formed in the pit of my stomach. A second sound came, sharper this time, like the scrape of something against wood. My eyes darted to the window. The curtains were drawn, the fabric swaying slightly from the warm air of the heater. My heart rate quickened. It's just a branch, I thought. Maybe the wind picked up. But I could feel my pulse in my throat as I stood and walked to the window. I hesitated for a moment before pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek out. The street was quiet, the houses dark. Nothing moved except for the branches of the trees swaying gently in the wind. I stepped back and turned to head upstairs. That's when I heard it. The faint, unmistakable creak of a floorboard coming from the kitchen. I froze in place, my ears straining to catch another sound. The heater clicked off, plunging the house into total silence. For a moment, nothing happened. And then it came again. The slow, deliberate sound of weight shifting on wood. I wasn't alone. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the floor. Slowly, I turned my head toward the darkened kitchen doorway, my breath shallow and quick. The lights were off, and the faint glow from the living room lamp barely reached into the room. I could see nothing but shadows. For a moment, I thought about calling out, asking if someone was there, but the words caught in my throat. I didn't want to confirm what I already knew. Instead, I stepped backward, careful to keep my movements slow and quiet. My phone was still on the coffee table, and if I could just grab it, I could call for help. My eyes stayed locked on the kitchen doorway as I reached for the phone, my fingers brushing against its smooth surface. Then a new sound, breathing, low and steady, just audible enough to make my blood run cold. It was coming from the kitchen, from someone standing just out of sight. I grabbed the phone and bolted for the stairs, my heart hammering so loudly I thought it might drown out my footsteps. I made it to my bedroom and locked the door, shoving a chair under the knob for good measure. My hands shook as I dialed 911. The operator's calm voice somehow both reassuring and terrifying as I whispered the details. "There's someone in my house." The minutes stretched endlessly as I crouched by the bed, the phone clutched tightly to my ear. I heard nothing now. No footsteps, no breathing, no creaks of the floorboards. It was almost worse than the noise. The silence made every shadow seem alive, every faint whisper of the wind a threat. The dispatcher assured me that officers were on their way, but the thought of waiting felt unbearable. I held my breath, straining to hear anything beyond the pounding of my own heart. And then the doorknob rattled. It was soft at first, almost testing. The chair under the knob shifted slightly, scraping against the floor. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a gasp. The rattling grew more insistent, the door shaking as whoever was on the other side tried to force it open. "Please," I whispered into the phone, tears prickling at my eyes. "They're at my door." The sound stopped abruptly, leaving the room eerily quiet once more. I could hear the dispatcher asking if I was still there, but I didn't dare speak. My ears were trained on the silence, waiting for the next sound. Suddenly, the faint wail of sirens cut through the night. Relief flooded me as the sound grew louder, closer. I heard heavy footsteps descending the stairs, fast and deliberate. The front door slammed, and then the house fell silent again. The officers arrived moments later, bursting through the front door and calling out. I unlocked my bedroom door cautiously, my legs trembling as I stepped out to meet them. They found no one. The back door was open, the lock broken. Whoever had been in the house was gone, vanishing into the night as quickly as they had appeared. The officers assured me they would patrol the area, that I would be safe now. But as I sat on the couch hours later, surrounded by the eerie quiet of the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. It gets dark fast in the woods during winter. The kind of dark that presses in around you, swallowing even the faintest flicker of light. That's the thing about living so far out. You forget how comforting the hum of civilization is. Out here, the silence is deafening. My name doesn't matter. I'm just a man who made enough money to buy peace and quiet, and now I live in a cabin miles from anyone. A millionaire who wanted solitude. But that doesn't matter. Back to the story. The night it all happened. The snow was falling in heavy sheets, and the wind howled like a wounded animal. I was sitting by the fire, a book in one hand and a glass of whiskey in the other. The crackle of the flames and the creak of the old log settling were the only sounds inside. Outside, though, there was a noise I couldn't place. At first, I thought it was just the wind, a low moaning sound, almost like a voice. But it didn't rise and fall like the wind does. It stayed steady, a mournful hum that sent shivers crawling up my spine. I got up, pulled on my coat, and cracked the door open to take a look. The cold hit me like a punch. The snow was nearly up to my knees and visibility was terrible. But that sound, it was louder now. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It sounded like a man. "Hello?" I called out, my voice vanishing into the night. "Is someone there?" No answer. Just that noise, coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. I told myself to let it go. There was no good reason to go wandering out into a blizzard. But something about that sound gnawed at me. It wasn't right. It was too human, too desperate. Grabbing my flashlight and rifle, I ventured out. The beam of light barely cut through the snow, but I followed the noise, trudging through the drifts. My breath puffed out in clouds, and every step felt like a mistake. The noise grew louder, clearer. It wasn't a hum anymore. It was a voice. Someone was calling for help. "Help me, please!" The voice was weak, shaky, and it sounded close now. I scanned the area, turning in slow circles. And then I saw it, a figure, slumped against a tree. It looked like a man, his clothes torn and frost-bitten hands clutching his chest. I rushed over, the snow crunching beneath my boots. "Hey, are you okay?" But as I got closer, something stopped me. The figure's head turned toward me, and the flashlight caught its face. It wasn't a man, not entirely. Its eyes were sunken, black pits, and its skin was stretched tight over jagged bones. It opened its mouth, and the voice that had called for help came out, but it didn't match the twisted thing in front of me. My instincts screamed at me to run. I stumbled back, almost dropping the flashlight, and the thing stood up. It was taller than I'd thought, much taller. Its limbs were impossibly thin, its fingers long and clawed. And then it did something that froze me in place. It mimicked my voice. "Hello, is someone there?" Hearing my own words parroted back to me in that hollow, rasping tone was worse than anything I'd ever experienced. I turned and bolted, my boots slipping on the icy ground. The flashlight swung wildly in my grip, casting erratic beams of light as I sprinted toward the cabin. Behind me I heard it moving. Not running, but loping, its long limbs making crunching sounds in the snow. It was fast. Too fast. The cabin door came into view, and I threw myself inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. My chest heaved as I fumbled for the rifle. The sound outside stopped. For a moment, the only noise was the crackling fire. Then came the knock. It was slow, deliberate, and impossibly steady. I gripped the rifle, my hands slick with sweat despite the freezing temperature. "Let me in," it said. The voice was mine. I didn't respond. I didn't move. The knocking continued, each knock louder than the last until it sounded like someone was using a battering ram. I backed away, the rifle raised, but the door never broke. The sound just stopped. Silence again. I don't know how long I sat there waiting for something to happen. Hours, maybe. When the sun finally rose, I forced myself to step outside. There were tracks in the snow-massive clawed footprints that led away from the cabin and into the woods. I followed them as far as I dared, but they just vanished, like whatever had made them had flown away. I haven't told anyone about that night. Who would believe me? People might say I've been alone too long, that the isolation has gotten to me. The crunch of gravel under my boots was the only sound as I walked along the narrow, unlit road. The November cold was biting, sharp enough to cut through my jacket and sting my face. My breath rose in short, visible clouds, and my flashlight flickered slightly with each uneven step. I was heading back to my car after a long day of hiking, frustrated that I had lost track of time. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, and now the woods around me were pitch black. Even with the flashlight, the shadows seemed alive, pressing closer every time I glanced away. I had parked at a lot about 2 miles from the trailhead, thinking nothing of it earlier in the day. Now, as I trudged along the isolated road, every instinct screamed that I should not have waited so long to leave. But I was not superstitious. This was just a walk. A lonely, cold walk. Then I heard it. At first I thought it was just the wind moving through the trees. A faint rustling, maybe. But then it came again. A deliberate snap, like a foot on a twig. I froze. The light from my flashlight jittered as my hand trembled slightly. Slowly, I swept the beam across the dense forest. Nothing. I exhaled shakily and told myself to relax. It was probably an animal. A deer, or maybe a raccoon scavenging in the underbrush. But as I started walking again, I could not shake the feeling that I was not alone. Another snap. This time it was closer. And not subtle. The kind of sound that gets under your skin. My heart kicked into overdrive, hammering against my ribs. I quickened my pace, trying to keep calm, but my breaths were shorter now, my hands clammier despite the cold. "Hello?" I called out, my voice hoarse. The word barely made it out of my throat before dissolving into the silence. No response, just the whisper of leaves in the wind. I hated how cliché it felt, like I was asking to be a horror movie victim. But what else was I supposed to do? The road ahead seemed endless, the beam of my flashlight illuminating nothing but gravel and weeds. My car was still at least a mile away. I cursed myself for coming out here alone. I glanced over my shoulder. Nothing. But that time, I could swear I had felt something. A presence. The sensation of being watched was so strong it felt physical, like a hand hovering just above my shoulder. I spun back around and forced myself to keep moving. Then I heard the sound again. Not a snap this time. Footsteps. Clear, heavy, deliberate. They were not trying to be quiet anymore. I turned around fully, swinging the flashlight wildly across the forest. My pulse was deafening in my ears. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Who would be out here, this far from anything, at this hour? The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, gripping the flashlight so hard my knuckles ached. The beam caught on something, a shape, standing just beyond the tree line. A tall, shadowy figure. They were not moving, just watching. "Who's there?" I demanded, forcing as much steel into my voice as I could. No answer. Just the silhouette, motionless. I did not wait for a response. Turning back toward the road, I started jogging, then running. I did not care how ridiculous it looked or sounded. I just needed to get to my car. Behind me, the footsteps started again. Faster this time. The gap between us was shrinking. I could hear their weight on the gravel now, their strides long and unrelenting. I forced myself to look straight ahead, my legs burning as I sprinted harder than I ever had in my life. The parking lot came into view. My car was the only one there, sitting under the dim orange glow of a single sputtering streetlight. Relief surged through me, but I did not slow down. I fumbled for my keys in my pocket, my frozen fingers clumsy and slow. Behind me, the footsteps were closing in. I reached my car and yanked the door open, diving inside and slamming it shut behind me. My hands shook so badly it took 3 tries to jam the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I threw it into reverse without looking. As I sped out of the lot, I risked a glance in the rearview mirror. No one was there. The road behind me was empty, just shadows and trees. I laughed nervously, the sound brittle and hollow. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. The cold, the darkness, it had gotten to me. I was safe now. I convinced myself of that as I drove, the heater blasting, my heart rate slowly steadying. But when I pulled into my driveway and got out of the car, I noticed something. A handprint, a single, muddy handprint smeared across the driver's side door. The highway stretched endlessly before us, flanked by barren fields and distant skeletal trees. The occasional farmhouse stood like a forgotten relic. My sister Emma sat next to me, scrolling through her phone, while my dad hummed along to old country songs on the radio. Thanksgiving was hours away, and we were headed to our aunt's house deep in rural Texas. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The first sign of trouble came as a sputter from the engine. "Everything all right, Dad?" I asked, glancing at the dashboard lights, which were flickering erratically. "Just needs some rest, like me," he joked, though his brow furrowed as he tapped the gas. The sputtering grew worse, and within minutes the car gave up entirely. We coasted to a stop on the shoulder of a narrow country road. Fields stretched out on either side, the nearest farmhouse a distant smudge on the horizon. "Great," Emma muttered. "No service." Dad sighed, getting out to pop the hood. I followed, mostly for moral support since I knew nothing about engines. The chill in the evening air bit through my jacket. As Dad fumbled with the engine, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance, growing brighter and closer. A rusted old truck pulled up alongside us. The driver leaned out, a man with a scruffy beard and a weathered face. He wore a faded plaid shirt, and his smile, though wide, didn't reach his eyes. "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice a low drawl. Dad straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Yeah, seems like it. Won't start." The man nodded, his smile widening. "Lucky I came along. Not much traffic out here. I've got a tow hitch. I can take y'all to my place. Got tools there." Dad hesitated, glancing at us. Emma shook her head slightly, but we didn't have many options. Night was falling fast, and the temperature was dropping. After a moment, Dad nodded. "All right, thanks. Appreciate it," he said. The man's smile lingered as he got out of his truck and attached the tow hitch to our car. Something about the way he moved, slow, deliberate, made my stomach knot. I tried to shake off the unease. He was helping us, after all. We climbed into the back of his truck, bundled together on the hard metal bed. The man started driving, the engine growling as we bumped along the uneven road. At first, it seemed fine. He took a few turns, the headlights cutting through the darkness. But soon, something felt wrong. "Isn't the highway back that way?" Emma whispered, pointing to the faint glow of taillights in the opposite direction. "Maybe it's a shortcut," I suggested, though I didn't believe it. The truck veered onto a dirt road, the tires crunching over gravel. The fields around us grew darker, the shadows deeper. My heart pounded as Emma gripped my arm. "Something's not right," she said. Dad knocked on the rear window, trying to get the man's attention, but the truck didn't slow. Instead, it picked up speed. "Get ready," Dad said, his voice tight. "Ready for what?" I asked, though I already knew. "To jump." The truck bounced over a pothole, and we took our chance. Dad went first, rolling off the side. I grabbed Emma's hand, and we jumped together, landing hard in the dirt. The truck's taillights disappeared into the darkness, and the night swallowed the sound of the engine. We lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, before Dad pulled us to our feet. "Come on," he said, his voice firm. "We've got to move." We stumbled through the fields, the cold biting harder now. In the distance, a faint light flickered. A farmhouse. We pushed through the tall grass, hearts pounding, until we reached the front porch. Dad knocked frantically, and a woman opened the door, her face wary but kind. "What happened?" she asked, her eyes darting to the fields behind us. "Car broke down," Dad said quickly. "We need help." She let us in, locking the door behind us. We spent the night huddled in her living room, too shaken to speak. The next morning, the police searched for our car. They found the spot where we had broken down, but the car and the man were gone. It was the kind of winter night you dream about. Quiet, cozy, and just cold enough to make a blanket feel like a luxury. I had everything set up perfectly. My favorite show queued up, a steaming mug of hot chocolate on the coffee table, and my oversized knit blanket wrapped snugly around me. Outside, the snow had started falling, soft and steady, coating everything in a silvery glow. The world felt miles away. I had barely settled into the couch when I heard it, a faint thud outside. I paused, the show playing faintly in the background, and glanced at the window. The heavy curtains were drawn, but the sound lingered in my mind. Probably snow falling off the roof, I thought. Or maybe a branch snapping under the weight. I shrugged it off and turned my attention back to the TV. Minutes passed, and I started to relax again. The warmth of the hot chocolate spread through me, and I let out a deep sigh. That's when I heard it again. Not a random thud this time. It was deliberate, heavy, like someone walking creeping around the side of the house. My stomach tightened. I muted the TV and sat perfectly still, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. Footsteps crunching in the snow, slow and deliberate. They stopped right by the side window. I felt the air leave my lungs. My heart started pounding so loudly I thought whoever was out there might hear it. Slowly, I reached for my phone on the armrest. My hands shook as I unlocked it and went to dial 911. Before I could press the call button, the footsteps moved again, heading toward the back door. My breath caught. I had locked it earlier, hadn't I? I couldn't remember. My mind was racing, going over every window and door in the house. Had I checked them all? Then I heard the handle jiggle. My blood went cold. Someone was trying to get in. The handle rattled harder, and the door creaked as if it might give under the pressure. I stood up, clutching my phone, unsure of what to do. I wanted to scream, to shout, but fear glued me in place. The jiggling stopped. Silence. Then the footsteps moved again, circling around toward the front. I ran to the living room and crouched behind the couch, peeking toward the door. The porch light was on, casting long shadows across the snow. For a moment, there was nothing, just the sound of my breathing and the faint whistle of the wind. Then a shadow moved across the porch. I bit my lip to keep from crying out. A figure loomed just outside the frosted glass of the front door. They stood there, motionless, as if they were listening. My thumb hovered over the call button, and then they knocked. It was soft at first, almost polite. Tap, tap, tap. My body locked up. The knocks grew louder, more insistent. Bang, bang, bang. I could see their silhouette shifting, pressing against the glass. I whispered to myself, "Go away." But my voice barely made a sound. Then they stopped. The shadow lingered for a moment before retreating into the night. I stayed frozen behind the couch, my phone clenched in my hand, waiting, listening. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no rattling. Just the sound of the wind picking up, blowing snow against the windows. I don't know how long I stayed there, crouched in the dark, heart racing. Eventually, I called the police. They arrived 20 minutes later, lights flashing, and searched the property. There were footprints all around the house, circling it again and again. But whoever it was, they were gone. The officer told me to stay somewhere else for the night. Just to be safe, he said. I packed a bag and left, but even now I can't shake the memory of those footsteps. Whoever they weren't in a hurry. They weren't desperate. They were patient. And that's what scares me the most. The snow was supposed to be the fun part. It started as a quick trip to the mountains for a family getaway. Me, my wife, our teenage daughter Sophie, and our 7-year-old son, Ben. I'd booked a cozy cabin near a ski resort, thinking it would be the perfect break from the grind. A chance to bond, unplug, and let the kids experience real snow for the first time. The road there was long and winding, cutting through dense forests that seemed to grow darker as the day dragged on. Sophie was glued to her phone despite our protests, while Ben kept pointing out every tree and patch of snow with the enthusiasm only a 7-year-old could muster. "Are we almost there?" Sophie groaned for the 5th time. "About an hour out," I said, glancing at the GPS. The screen flickered for a second, but I chalked it up to the spotty reception. The first flakes started falling as the sun dipped below the treetops, painting the forest in hues of orange and purple. Ben pressed his face to the window, watching in awe as the snow picked up. But as the light faded, the snow came harder, faster, until it wasn't picturesque anymore. It was blinding. "This storm wasn't in the forecast," my wife muttered, checking her phone. "No service." The GPS gave out completely just as we passed a faded wooden sign. "Scenic route, detour ahead." I slowed the car, squinting to read it through the snow. "Should we turn back?" she asked. "No point," I said. "The cabin's not far. This'll probably loop us back on track." The road narrowed, winding deeper into the forest. The snow thickened, and soon it felt like we were the only people left in the world. The trees loomed closer, their gnarled branches scraping the sides of the car. Then the engine stuttered. "Don't do this to me," I muttered, gripping the wheel. The dashboard lights flickered and the car sputtered to a stop. "What happened?" Sophie asked, her voice sharp with panic. "Probably just the cold," I said, trying to sound calm. "I'll take a look." I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit me like a slap, the wind whipping snow into my face. I popped the hood and stared at the engine, but I'm no mechanic. The truth was, I had no idea what was wrong. When I slammed the hood shut, that's when I noticed the sound. A faint, high-pitched whistle carried on the wind. I turned, scanning the dark forest with my flashlight. Nothing but trees and swirling snow, but the sound persisted, thin, mournful, and somehow human. Back in the car, I tried to keep my voice steady. "It's probably just the wind. We'll wait it out until the snow lets up." "It doesn't sound like wind," Sophie said, pulling her knees to her chest. Ben was staring out the window, his little face pale. "I saw something," he whispered. "What do you mean, buddy?" I asked, trying to keep the unease from creeping into my voice. "There was a man by the trees." Ben, it's dark. You probably just saw a shadow, my wife said. He shook his head wide-eyed. No, he was really tall, and he didn't have a face. Sophie rolled her eyes. He's just trying to scare us. But Ben wasn't laughing. The whistle grew louder, closer. It wasn't coming from the wind. It wasn't coming from anything natural. I'll check it out, I said, opening the door. My wife grabbed my arm. Don't, she said, but I couldn't ignore it. If someone was out there, lost in the storm, I couldn't just leave them. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I stepped into the forest, the flashlight barely cutting through the dark. The whistle seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, bouncing between the trees. Hello? I called out. Is someone there? No answer. I was about to turn back when I saw them tracks in the snow. They were massive, like a man's, but impossibly long and narrow. And they didn't lead away. They circled the car. My heart pounded as I sprinted back, slipping on the icy ground. Get in the back seat, I shouted as I threw open the door. Now! What's going on? My wife demanded, her voice shaking. Just move. She pulled Ben into the back, Sophie scrambling after them. I climbed into the driver's seat and locked the doors. What is it, Dad? Sophie asked, her voice trembling. Before I could answer, the car rocked. It wasn't subtle like the wind. It was deliberate, like something had shoved it. Stay down, I whispered, clutching the wheel like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. The whistle stopped. And then came the scratching. Long, deliberate scrapes of something sharp running along the roof of the car. Ben started to cry. Sophie held him tight, her face buried in his hair. My wife reached for my hand, gripping it like a vice. The car rocked again, harder this time. I couldn't see anything through the snow, but the sound of those claws was unmistakable. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. We sat in silence, too terrified to breathe. I gripped the flashlight, ready to swing it at whatever came next. But nothing did. When the snow eased up an hour later, I dared to look outside. The tracks were gone. The car started on the first try. We didn't speak a word the rest of the drive. They say hindsight is 20/20, but sometimes it takes years to see the truth. I think about that night every winter, especially when the power flickers, and I catch myself holding my breath like I'm waiting for something to happen. It's been over a decade, but I'm only just now starting to piece it together. I was living alone at the time, a fresh college graduate renting a small house on the edge of town, the kind of place where the woods creep right up to your backyard, and you can't see your neighbors unless the leaves are off the trees. It was a fixer-upper, but it was cheap, and cheap was all I could afford back then. The night it happened, a storm rolled in faster than the forecast had predicted. I'd spent the day trying to wrap pipes and clear snow off the driveway, but by the time the sun set, the snow was coming down so hard I couldn't see past the window. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the windows and shaking the roof. Then the power went out. I still remember how quiet it got, how the hum of the fridge and the buzz of the overhead light vanished all at once, leaving nothing but the storm outside. I lit a few candles and threw some logs in the fireplace, settling in with a blanket and a book. At the time, I thought it was just another stormy night. Around midnight, the first strange thing happened. There was a knock at the door. Not loud, just 3 soft taps, barely audible over the wind. My first thought was that it had to be a branch or something. But it came again, more deliberate this time. I stood up, my pulse quickening. Who would be out here in this storm at this hour? I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the door. The porch light was out, of course, but the snow reflected enough light that I could see the faint outline of someone standing there. Hello? I called out, keeping the door locked. No answer. Do you need help? I tried again. Still nothing. Just the shadowy figure standing there, unmoving. A rational person would have called the police. But the phone lines were down, and I didn't have a cell phone back then. Besides, some part of me, the naive part, figured it was probably someone stranded in the storm. I cracked the door open, just enough to see out. The figure was gone. My stomach sank. The snow on the porch was untouched. No footprints leading to or from the door. I told myself I'd imagined it, that the storm and the flickering candlelight were playing tricks on me. But then I heard it, a creak coming from the back of the house. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. The house was old, creaks and groans were part of the deal. But this wasn't the kind of sound wood makes when it's settling. This was deliberate, like someone stepping carefully over loose floorboards. I grabbed the fireplace poker and crept toward the sound. My flashlight beam danced across the walls, and my breath came in shallow puffs. The back door was wide open. Snow was blowing in, already forming a small drift on the floor. I knew I'd locked it. I was sure of it. That's when I saw them footprints. They led from the door into the kitchen and then stopped right in front of the pantry. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. No answer. I yanked the pantry door open, swinging the flashlight inside. Nothing. Just cans of soup and boxes of cereal. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring at those footprints. They were long, narrow, with a strange gait that didn't look quite human. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon that had somehow pushed the door open. But deep down, I didn't believe it. Eventually, I shut the door, locked it again, and shoved a chair under the handle for good measure. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the fire, the poker in one hand and the flashlight in the other. By morning, the storm had passed, and the power came back on. I chalked the whole thing up to a mix of paranoia and bad weather. But every winter after that, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone had been in the house with me that night. It wasn't until years later, after reading about home invasions and hearing stories of people finding squatters in their attics, that it started to make sense. The figure at the door, the footprints leading to the pantry, the open back door. I think someone was testing me, seeing if I'd let them in, and I think I got lucky. The cabin was exactly what I needed. Secluded, quiet, tucked away in a dense stretch of forest where cell service didn't exist, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the November wind. I had come here to clear my head, to escape the noise of the city, and maybe to finish the short story that had been gnawing at my mind for months. The first few days were peaceful. I split logs for the fire, brewed coffee over a stovetop flame, and watched the sunset bleed into the tree line. By the third night, the isolation had started to feel comfortable, like a blanket you don't realize you needed. Then, on the fourth night, I saw it. I was sitting on the small porch, wrapped in a heavy jacket, staring out into the trees. The sky was overcast, moonlight only barely breaking through the clouds. The fire in the cabin crackled faintly behind me, warmth spilling out from the open door. At first, I thought it was a shadow, something dark and low moving through the trees about 20 yards out. I squinted, leaning forward slightly. It was too far to make out details, but it moved again, deliberate, almost slow enough to seem unnatural. My pulse quickened. A deer, I told myself. Maybe a coyote. But then it stepped into the dim light from the cabin, and I froze. It was wrong. It looked like a deer, at least at first glance. Long, spindly legs, a narrow frame. But it was too thin, its ribs pushing against its hide in a way that made it seem sickly. Its head tilted slightly, jerky like a broken puppet. Its eyes didn't catch the light the way an animal's eyes should. They were flat, dull, and black. I stayed still, hoping it would lose interest and wander off. But instead, it stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, as if it was testing the ground with every step. Then it stopped and turned its head toward me. My breath caught. Its face wasn't quite right. The shape was there, but the details were wrong, like a bad imitation. Its nose was too narrow, its mouth too wide. The skin around it stretched and cracked as if it didn't quite fit. It watched me, unblinking, and I felt pinned under its gaze. I stood slowly, the wooden porch creaking beneath my boots. The thing didn't move. It just kept staring, its head cocking slightly to one side. I stepped back toward the door, my hand fumbling for the handle. As soon as my fingers touched the cold metal, it did something I'll never forget. It stood up, not on all fours, but upright, its legs straightening into an unnatural, bony stance. Its head stayed tilted, its neck craning as if to keep its eyes locked on me. My stomach twisted as it took a single, shaky step forward on two legs, its movements wrong, jerky and awkward, like it was learning how to walk. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The fire crackled behind me, but the warmth felt distant. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear. For a moment, there was nothing but the wind. Then I heard it, scraping. The faint, deliberate sound of claws against wood. My stomach sank as it moved to the window, the sound following it like it was circling the cabin. I grabbed the rifle I'd brought for emergencies, my hands shaking as I loaded it. The scratching stopped suddenly, and the silence pressed in like a weight. I stared at the door, waiting, every nerve in my body screaming. And then came the voice. It was quiet, almost a whisper, and it came from just outside the door. Help, me. My blood ran cold. It wasn't right. The voice was off, like a recording that had been warped. The tone was flat, the words stretched out unnaturally. Help me, it repeated, this time louder, insistent. I raised the rifle, pointing it at the door, but my hands were trembling too much to keep steady. The voice came again, and this time it was closer, pressed against the wood, just inches away. "Please." I stepped back, my chest heaving. The voice stopped, replaced by silence so complete it made my ears ring. I stood there for what felt like hours, the rifle clutched to my chest, waiting for it to come back. But it didn't. When dawn broke, I finally dared to open the door. The porch was empty, the trees still and quiet in the cold morning air. But on the ground, just outside the door, were marks long, deep gouges in the wood that didn't look like they came from any animal I'd ever seen. I packed up and left that morning, leaving behind the firewood, the coffee pot, and the unfinished story. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't natural. It wasn't supposed to be here.